Yes.
Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the George Washington Corner Society for the History of Medicine here at the Rochester Academy of Medicine. My name is Christy Slobogin, and I'm an assistant professor of health humanities and bioethics at the University of Rochester. I've taken over the Corner Society for this academic year from the wonderful McCall Ross, who many of you know, historian of medicine, MD, and Charles E. and Dale L. Phelps, professor in public health and policy. So I'm really honored to be at the helm while she is on research leave this year. So I'd like to start, as usual, with a little bit of background first. So Dr. George Washington Corner was the first professor of anatomy at the University of Rochester Medical School. In 1934, he organized a medical history club to provide opportunities for students and faculty to attend lectures and enjoy lively discussions on all topics in the history of medicine. And today, the Corner Society continues that tradition of bringing stimulating speakers to Rochester's physicians, students, scholars, and community members. And I'm so happy to see so many of you here today. So this is our second of 6 lectures for this 2024 and 2025 season. This year's lectures range from early medical photography to math and Chinese medicine. These talks, like tonight's, all take place on Wednesday evenings and are followed by a reception. We have flyers right in the entryway if you want more information about the upcoming talks. There's also information on the Rochester Academy of Medicine's website and on the Corner Society's listserv. So if you want to be added to that email list and you're not already on it, please let me know and I can add you straight away. While I have a captive audience, obviously I have to plug our next event, so just bear with me. On November 20th, so our next Corner Society lecture, we will have Alison Moorhead from Queen's University. She'll be giving a talk titled Edvard Munch and the Medicalization of Modern Life. So this will look at the medical histories and contexts that are apparent in the works of this world-famous painter of the scream. So I hope to see many of you there. We're grateful that these events can continue thanks to the generous support of the Humanities Center at the University of Rochester, the Paul M. Scheibe Center for Bioethics at the University of Rochester Medical Center, and the Department of Health Humanities and Bioethics. I also must thank those dues-paying members of the Corner Society. If you're interested in becoming a member, please do let me know, and there's information about that on our website as well. I'd also like to thank Larry Guttmacher and Bob Riley for their long-standing support of the Corner Society. Bob is in there setting up our reception for this evening. And I'd also like to thank Sue Layton here at the Rochester Academy of Medicine for her facilitation. And now, finally, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Nick John Ramos, who's an assistant professor in history, Africana studies, and the Center for Science, Technology, and Society at Drexel University. He's previously held appointments in the Department of Africana Studies, the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, and the Koga Institute for the Humanities as the Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow of Race in Science and Medicine at Brown University. And he served as a Ford Postdoctoral Fellow in the Program of Race, Science, and Society at the University of Pennsylvania. He holds degrees from the University of Southern California and the University of California, Irvine. I've heard Dr. Ramos give several papers before, so I'm really looking forward to his talk tonight, which is part of his book, a book manuscript that's currently under contract with University of California Press, titled Health as Property, Making Race, Sexuality, and Poverty Productive in Global Los Angeles, 1865 to 1986. And we are going to hear a segment of that project tonight. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ramos.
Thank you so much, Christy. I want to thank you for the invitation. I want to also thank Chris Donnelly, Sue Layton, and Bob Riley. Last time I was here for the Corner Society, there was an ice storm that kept me on the tarmac for a very long time, and McCall got me here right on time to see like 2 or 3 people in this room, who are actually, a lot of them have returned, actually, the couple people here. But I'm a big fan of the Corner Society, and last time I had to spend a really great time with McCall and Ted Brown. Ted Brown's, I've served as a CIGARIS coordinator, so I'm like just in love with the folks here. I want to also thank as well the folks from Black Studies who are here, Medical Humanities, and all the folks joining in on Zoom. Hello, and online. I mean, this is really a dream space for somebody who works at the, history of medicine and psychiatry and Black studies. I'm really, really looking forward to the conversation that we have. This paper previews how I've rearranged work published in my scholarly articles. And so you're gonna see like what the chapter looks like, because that's what this argument is. All right, so I'll begin. So in July 1967, Los Angeles Times writer Jack Jones updated readers on the progress of community plans made in the wake of the 1965 Watts uprisings to provide Black residents with an entirely new health system centered on a new Black-led academic medical center called King Drew. Ahead of King Drew's opening, Jones noted the construction of the South Central Multi-Purpose Health Service Center, or as I'll call it today, the Watts Clinic, a primary care clinic funded by the Office of Equal Opportunity, that's the OEO, and owned by USC, that's the University of Southern California. And he updated folks on Central City Community Mental Health Center, a community mental health clinic funded by the National Institutes for Mental Health, that's NIMH, and led by Dr. J. Alfred Cannon, a Black psychiatrist from UCLA. In addition to serving as new entry and referral points for the future medical center, both clinics were also meant to serve as experiments in distributing health services to the poor. Although both served Black clientele, Jones's article revealed that one seemed to be more successful because it was Black run. Local community members, for instance, discussed their apprehension over the Watts Clinic by describing USC as, quote, a white-oriented school, a term signaling USC's identity in the Black community as a colonial employer, neighbor, and healthcare provider because of its long history of abusing Black workers, displacing Black residents, and using Black patients for medical experimentation and for training. Local Black physicians particularly saw USC as an intruder, intent on, quote, stifling the Negro practitioner by outcompeting them in a corporate bid to force them to, quote, take jobs under them. In contrast, Jones's article offered a glowing description of Central City, a former donation-based mental health clinic recently expanded and relocated to a larger location through an infusion of new federal and state funding. Unlike the racial tension of USC's clinic, the article portrayed Central City as being more responsive to Black people because Cannon held lived experience as a Black man. Cannon boasted of the center's growing clientele by emphasizing short-term therapy, maintaining an open-door policy to never turn anyone down, nor have, quote, a waiting list, and by characterizing the center as a place to, quote unquote, dispense help and advice rather than diagnosis and treatment. Cannon's supposedly race-sensitive sensibilities allowed Central City to reach a population usually fearful and suspicious of accessing mental health services because of psychiatry's long history of unfairly diagnosing and incarcerating Black individuals as mad or insane. Although divergent in purpose and services from each other, with one clinic being centered around the relationship between individuals, their bodily health, and hospitals, and the other being centered around individuals, their mental health, and state hospitals, the fact that both were built with the same mission to lift the income and health standards of poor Black people helped highlight Jones's conclusion that Central City's efforts appeared more successful in reaching Black people than USC's clinic because of the skin color of its leaders. As my talk today will show, Jones's conclusion was not an isolated observation, but one that federal authorities increasingly saw as a solution to waning support for anti-poverty programming. Rather than achieve equality through integration, as many activists had envisioned before the mid-60s, the obstacles of whiteness at USC's clinic, and the runaway success of Central City gave federal authorities the impression that Black people's inclusion in mainstream society might be met more quickly and efficiently. This is like the transformation of James Brown. Through the federal support, we can talk more about it in Q&A. Through federal support for Black nationalism in the form of Black capitalism, a term describing consumer and business practices geared at channeling capital towards the development of Black spaces and people. Indeed, as Mehrsa Baradaran has argued, the federal government would solidify Black capitalism as official White House policy when Nixon ascended the presidency in 1969. Outside of Black studies and Black history, Black nationalism in the form of Black capitalism is the other less well-known and understudied wing of the Black Power movement. Popular depictions of the civil rights movement's turn towards the Black Power movement have tended to portray Black nationalists as being anti-government and anti-establishment, given the popularity of anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist stances that many of its militant figures and organizations such as Malcolm X and the Black Panthers took in their analysis of power. This singular association in popular culture, however, has led to the overrepresentation of the Black Panthers' political views in the scholarly literature around community clinics, and has obscured the government's long-standing bipartisan programmatic support for Black cultural nationalists like Ron Karenga's US organization and Canon, who saw the federal government's vision to achieve racial inclusion through capitalism and multiculturalism as aligned with their own vision to strengthen Black communities through deeper racial unity. My examination of Black nationalism and its relationships to multiculturalism and racial liberalism are central themes in my larger book manuscript, Health as Property, Making Race, Sexuality, and Poverty Productive in Global Los Angeles from 1965 to 1986, which is currently under contract with the University of California Press's American Crossroads series. The book essentially argues Los Angeles' mostly white political establishment and electorate sought to prevent the return of rioting and social disorder of the 1965 Watts uprisings by giving Black politicians and physicians the ability to experiment with new federal health programs to fight poverty using Medicare and Medicaid by building a health system called King Drew Medical Center. Instead of alleviating Black poverty, I argue that health systems, hospital, clinic, mental health, and emergency medical services functioned with the remaking of Jim Crow segregation, enlarged police outfits, and more highly securitized state hospitals to help the region's ascendant multicultural elite manage the worklessness, undocumented immigration, and working poverty resulting from post-1960s global economic shifts. My research reveals politicians, medical experts, and health policymakers mobilize consumerist discourses of health and moral uplift embedded in the racial and sexual liberalism of the 1960s and 70s to reform the supposed backwards spatialized sexuality, reproductive politics, and culture of queer, undocumented, and poor people of color living in inner city neighborhoods. My talk today brings together the histories of neighborhood health clinics and the histories of community mental health clinics together into the same frame to argue that a narrative emphasis on the melanated skin color of physicians obscures how leaders at USC's and Central City's clinics both shared the same assumptions about poverty and mobilized the same methods, practices, and approaches to acculturate formerly excluded patient populations into mainstream medicine. So historians have rightly narrated the history of community clinics and community mental health clinics as two entirely separate histories because of their functional relationships, each explain their distinct purposes within a larger health referral system. So here I'm just pointing out that one is supposed to prevent and divert patients from more expensive hospital care, and the other is supposed to divert and prevent referrals to state hospitals, right? Keeping their histories separate, however, hides how clinicians across clinic types saw it as their unique historical responsibility to inculcate patients with a sense of financial responsibility that few mainstream physicians saw as necessary in their own paying and privately insured patient populations. Their collective work in the 1960s and 70s sought to produce ideal citizen consumers that extend what historian Nayan Shah refers to as ideal citizen subjects. Rather than exclude subjects from citizenship solely on the basis of their gender, race, nationality, or economic standing, Shah argues the, quote, objective of liberal governance over the 20th century increasingly aimed to, quote, cultivate citizen subjects who can govern themselves by, quote, granting authority to professionals who are licensed and empowered by the state to create norms of individual conduct, make judgments, and administer policies. As professionals licensed and empowered by the state, clinicians extended public health's early 20th century concern over personal hygiene to the realm of consumer responsibility through the expansion of third-party taxpayer-paid health insurance programs such as Medicare and Medicaid. Whereas professionals once relied on relatively low-budget public health approaches to maximize population health, such as universal hand washing and latrine use, clinicians after 1965 increasingly saw it as their responsibility to teach the poor how to manage different health options while being, in their opinion, mindful of the wishes of white taxpayers footing the bill. Thus, rather than solely focus on the melanated skin color of King Drew's health clinic leadership, my talk today traces how leaders within Los Angeles's anti-poverty clinics sought to produce ideal citizen consumers who shared the medical belief that breadwinning manhood's supposedly culturally evolved kinship patterns of gender distinctiveness and sexual complexity were necessary prerequisites for individuals to possess good health and the capacity for economic rationality. Anti-poverty clinicians, through the associative properties of how medical authorities defined health in relation to gendered labor participation, offered poor citizens the ability to psychologically inhabit normality and health, two related states of being they believed proved more seductive and more durable than economic security itself. It was, more importantly, something poor people of color had particularly been long denied on the basis of race and class alone. Whether it be a clinic led by a white or Black physician, the aim of anti-poverty clinics sought to encourage the poor to see work and respectable marriage and family as practices that made them healthy and normal citizens, regardless of their skin color or class. All anti-poverty clinic leaders, regardless of their expertise or race, however, confronted a Black political landscape where Black people thought divergently about what constituted good health based on ongoing debates within the Black community about the relationship of race to illness. I'll talk a little bit about these different visions of what health means from the Black Panthers, some from the welfare rights activists that I look at. But really, it's this question that MLK asked: where do we go from here when there are so many different competing ideas of what it means to be Black in the mid-1960s and early 70s? They additionally confronted a healthcare landscape reshaped by a larger consumer and patient rights movement, increasingly suspicious of whether or not physicians, psychiatrists, general hospitals, and state hospitals could truly hold the best interest of patients in a unregulated health market. As the civil rights movement gave way to the Black Power movement and a new patient rights and consumer rights movement, clinicians found themselves deeply invested in testing which methods and narratives of citizenship best produced the desiring subject that most closely resembled their idea of an ideal citizen consumer. So it is well known that designers of anti-poverty legislation built mechanisms to prevent the misuse of government funds through what federal authorities referred to as the citizen participation mandate, which required that all beneficiaries of federal money recruit the poor into the design and implementation of all anti-poverty programs. While the law appears benevolent in its commitment to inclusion of once excluded populations in matters of shared governance, historians of anti-poverty programming, like Alice O'Connor here, argue the mandate's true intent sought to acculturate the way the poor saw, thought of, and understood poverty to the same way that economists saw, thought of, and understood it. That is, rather than see poverty as a natural product of capitalist inequality, anti-poverty programs sought to teach the poor to think of their poverty as a problem created by past practices of social isolation and of poor individual choices. Anti-poverty advocates thus saw the mainstream civil rights movement's emphasis on capitalism and democratic participation as rhetorical mechanisms to unleash the market potential of Black consumers who had been previously isolated from participation in the mainstream economy. In legal terms, they saw the Civil Rights Act as opening up opportunities for Black people to have jobs, homes, and services they were previously barred from, regardless of how real access to those jobs, homes, and services are. This is sort of like a free trade agreement, right, before NAFTA. Rather than see it as the state's role to guarantee that citizens achieve similar economic outcomes, the state moved to ensure every citizen was afforded the same opportunity to obtain a well-paying job, own a home, and have access to comprehensive health care on the same terms as citizens who had access to them before the civil rights movement. The problem then, as most anti-poverty advocates saw it, was not how to empower the poor to determine a completely new future for themselves through anti-poverty programming's shared governance and funding, but to help the poor help themselves to the future that others had designed for them. Federal policy programming thus aimed to avoid creating an alternative competing state option for healthcare by encouraging recipients to seek work and paying for their own healthcare as part and parcel of being a normal and healthy citizen. Although such objectives required state expansion to achieve a larger health market, the state's overall programmatic agenda counted on people who appeared to refuse to live independently of state assistance in spite of every opportunity to do so, as consumers who countered new appropriate ideas of use. As Nancy Toms argues, new appropriate ideas of use, however, were in flux given the rise of a consumer and patient rights movement and two interrelated community health and community mental health movements. Federal health policymakers explicitly did not want poor Black residents to use Medicare and Medicaid in ways that repeated the frequent, haphazard, and uneducated consumer behavior of white paying patients that made healthcare so profitable before 1965. And they feared that physicians and hospital owners would continue to use their power and authority to exploit new federal programs for profit. Okay, so that's like the bind. Fear of a larger tax commitment to Medicare and Medicaid, together with growing concern over increased number of Black inmates incarcerated in state hospitals, led federal and local officials in California to aggressively support the proliferation of anti-poverty clinics and community mental health clinics to curb taxpayers' commitments to Black healthcare. As we know from David Barden Smith's scholarship, the OEO piloted a series of anti-poverty clinics inspired by the work of Dr. H. Jack Geiger and the medical community on human rights in 1965. I'd love to talk about Geiger. He's really interesting, but we're not in this talk today, but I could in Q&A. The OEO funded several clinics, including USC's Watts Clinic, led by Doctors Elsie Georgi and Robert Trancata, two white liberal progressive physicians. USC's $2.4 million Watts Clinic consisted of 3 separate medical office wings connected to a central core of supporting pharmaceutical, X-ray, clinical laboratory, and data processing services. Georgie explained the clinic's architecture was meant to give poor Black residents a, quote, one-stop neighborhood health center designed to provide all medical, dental, and all health services except hospitalization for the whole family. Although its services were nominally free, OEO officials strove to explain that all its services were contingently offered on the premise the poor reformed their own opinion about poverty and themselves. As one brochure explained, OEO clinics were meant to do more than just, quote, reduce the incidence of disease and disability, important though that is. Its true purpose was to help, quote, the neighborhood to see itself as, quote, a source of physical and social contamination that was, quote, costly and menacing in both physical and political terms for the broader community of which the neighborhood is a part. As the phrase earn acceptance reveals, clinic leaders understood the Black freedom movement as not a plea for Black self-determination, but as a plea for Black citizens to enjoy, as consumers, all the same benefits, services, and treatment conferred to insured white patients. This aim to re-educate the poor manifested through the architecture of the clinic itself. As Chankata explained, the clinic's vision sought to, quote, organize medical care to mirror healthcare practices among insured patients by ensuring that, quote, every patient saw the same doctor on each visit. The idea of assigning each poor family to a family physician was more than a ploy to give poor Black people a consumer experience befitting of an insured white patient. It was also the primary means of, quote, interrupting the cycle of poverty, I don't even know where I am, tied illness and undereducation and unemployability together. Just want to make sure I'm on the right slide. Okay. Through the exchanges, oh yeah, that's right, I'm right. Of confidence made possible by the clinic's pairing of a family physician with poor families, Chankata claimed clinicians could get to the problems, quote, which seemingly have nothing to do with health, such as, quote, worry over money problems or worry about a son who has gotten into trouble that can cause or aggravate medical problems. Once identified, the clinician could refer the patient to a team of psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and neighborhood health agents to, quote, change situations which cause problems in their day-to-day living, or refer the patient to a health education team to, quote, help individuals and groups prevent and control health problems through a range of available self-help literature. These statements reveal that the clinic's health services masked a higher purpose centered around psychological reform, particularly the supposed psychology of poverty associated with culture of poverty theory. In this regard, USC's clinic did not define good health as the absence of disease, illness, or even poverty itself, but as the psychological presence of a striving subject smart enough and intelligent enough to improve their individual capacity to, quote, function responsibly on their own behalf. USC explained their hope to achieve this by drawing on the discursive total health framework of Head Start, the director, Dr. Julius Richmond, who argued racism had, quote, so chronically debilitated and demoralized poor Black people biologically and or psychosocially that they were by the 1960s and 70s, quote, powerless to improve their health or socioeconomic condition without assistance or leadership of anti-poverty agencies. So, as McCall-Roth argued, Richmond's theory effectively posited that Black people could not be expected to function as normal and healthy people because of their past historical deprivation and isolation, and they needed programs like Head Start and Medicaid that gave them enough of a taste of normality for them to want and strive for more on their own, right? It's like a taste, and you should want more after you get it. As Merlin Chokwan-Yoon has shown, some Watts residents supported the clinic because it brought services closer to their homes that were previously far or non-existent. That's the top left quote there. But a great many others refused to use the clinic under the advice of many local Black physicians and leaders who cautioned residents they would be subjected to the same inhumane treatment and experimentation associated with the region's white-led public hospital care. Conflict between the clinic's white leadership and its all-Black community board over issues of shared governance and hiring practices eventually led to observations that the clinic's goals to advance, quote, total health care and the use of the health center as a tool of social intervention were stalled and waylaid in favor of just dispensing services. So this is a nightmare for them because they're just realizing we're just giving out welfare services in the form of healthcare, right? USC's inability to get anti-poverty efforts off the ground contrasted with the perceived success of Central City, right? Inspired by Frederick Wertham's Lafard Clinic in Harlem, Dr. J. Alfred Cannon originally opened Central City on the premises of the Church of Christian Fellowship, a 300-member congregation located in the integrated neighborhood of West Adams. After the 1965 uprisings, Cannon won $900,000 from the NIMH to move the clinic to the city's historic Black neighborhood of South Central. In spite of the fact that Central City focused on mental health services rather than USC's bodily health services, Central City effectively shared the same architecture and programmatic ends as USC by sharing its vision to produce Black citizen consumers who saw work, free market healthcare, and normative family life as prerequisites to being normal and healthy. Whereas USC's clinics enticed the poor to participate in its economic reform programs by using health services as its incentives, Central City enticed the poor to participate in anti-poverty programming by using social service programs to connect participants to housing, food security, job placement, and youth programs. In fact, reporters described Central City as a facility with two doors, one to, quote, deal with the mental ills found in city slums, and another marked community service center. As Richard Sandville, a Central City administrator, explained, quote, many times we find that people who need economic aid also need mental or emotional treatment, and we walk them from our community service center through corridors to our consultation rooms. This is very much the community-based service organization model that exists today. So if you go to a CBO, this is the model. Be it in consultation rooms or in spaces dedicated to social service casework, Cannon was more explicit than USC's leaders in asserting that desiring work, free market healthcare, and normative family life made citizens not only normal and healthy, but that practicing and inhabiting a mindset centered on these values made Black individuals truly culturally African, made them truly Black. In this regard, Central City's leaders agreed with USC's leadership on the need to produce economically independent subjects, but believed that white physicians directing Black patients to these norms only produced citizens who could, quote, act according to society's expectations, but not think like a person who owned themselves. As with many psychiatrists writing and thinking about racial liberalism at mid-century, such as Kenneth and Mamie Clark, Alvin Poussaint, Frederick Wertham, Justice Polar, and Abram Gardner and Lionel Obasi, Cannon's writings show he believed, sorry, this is me, like, my voice getting, writings show he believed that holding Black people's actions up to white standards and expectations had devastating consequences for the Black psyche. Drawing on several competing anti-racist psychiatric schools of thought, Cannon argued that Black children's improper identification with white norms and values produced a psychic conflict in Black adolescents that resulted in sexual maladjustments and arrested forms of sexual development in adult life that, in his opinion, accounted for the perceived high frequency of absent fathers, welfare mothers, and homosexuality in Black communities. Cannon's research thus posited that effective therapeutic interventions for Black people not only had to produce a proper sense of one's relatedness to other genders and sexualities, but also had to produce an appropriate sense of relatedness to one's supposed proper race and culture to make oneself truly normal. By linking gender and sexuality with race and culture into one interlocking psychological matrix, he parried cultural poverty's thesis that Black children's exposure to a lack of positive Black role models prevented Black people from economically advancing and really psychologically advancing, right? To unlock Black people's supposedly natural and healthy psychological development as African descended people, he argued for the rebirth of African cultural practices that help Black individuals, quote, to understand, relate to, and accept their ancestral core. As such, Cannon argued his expectations of gender norms were not European, in spite of the fact they look similar to white norms in terms of appearance, behavior, and practices because they were rooted in African cultural practices that he considered predated colonization. Cannon's desire to make two gender binary and heterosexuality compulsory in Black communities mark how he sought to mobilize scientific racism towards new anti-racist ends. This is what people call fugitive science. He sought to intervene on and challenge psychiatric racisms and really Black eugenics. Psychiatric racism's long-held belief that Black people were incapable of psychic interiority and self-governance because they supposedly lacked the gender distinctiveness and sexual complexity of white heterosexual men and women. By providing Black children with a proper system of relatedness based on scientific ideas about the relationship between evolved minds, civilization, right, economic development, and racial groups, Cannon sought to prove that Black people were most naturally Black when they ironically looked, acted, and behaved as distinctively gendered and sexually evolved as white straight men and women. Essentially, I know, kind of crazy, right? Essentially, Cannon agreed with racial science's gendered and sexual hierarchies, but disagreed with its racial order by arguing that all racial groups held the same potential to be just as evolved as straight white men and women. This is psychiatric universalism that's playing with these sort of ideas. And this is essentially where I'm really thinking through Hortense Spiller's idea of Black gender. And this is a response to that, Black gender. News coverage of Central City reveals Cannon used a form of psychoanalysis tailored to Black working class individuals he referred to as instant therapy, a term which suggested he deployed the method as a way to signal to other psychiatrists who doubted that the method could be used on Black people, that Black people were as psychologically modern and sexually complex as white middle-class patients. The therapy Cannon preferred and used more widely appeared to be a modernized form of cognitive behavioral therapy. Central City's hallmark programs, for example, were a teen queen club for Black girls and a karate class for Black boys. The teen queen club and karate class for boys exposed Black children to positive adult role models early in life to prevent the development of sexually maladjusted personalities. Cannon remarked, for instance, that Central City's teen queen club was, quote, based on the idea that Black is beautiful, and its stress on Afro-American standards of beauty, grooming, and conduct helped the young Negro girl build an image of herself that relates to her environment. Cannon also defended the instruction of boys in karate as a virile sport that conveyed ideas of discipline and proper diet to young Black men. Cannon felt these programs were more urgent in the wake of the civil rights movement because he feared that Black people dangerously subjected themselves to more troubling psychoses as they economically advanced into neighborhoods, educational settings, and workplaces dominated by white people. He's really saying integration is putting Black people at risk when they go into these multiracial places where they're the minority. Rather than make Black people feel more normal and accepted, Cannon argued the tendency of Black elites to, quote, ape white middle-class standards and, quote, spend much money on attractive appearance to, quote, correct any doubt of the validity of the racial myths erected against them, demonstrated that doubt and worry continued to haunt the psychic space of Black elites despite the relative economic security and social status vis-a-vis the poor. Such observations pointed to mental health problems that integrationist-based and class-based approaches to racial psychiatry assumed would cease once Black individuals successfully availed themselves of opportunity and class advancement. Indeed, by the 1970s, Cannon believed the imposter syndrome induced in Black psyches under white supremacy was leading to, quote, problems of child delinquency, drug problems, high divorce rate, and other evidence of stress and social fragmentation in Black subjects who were, quote, widely regarded as having made it. So he's really in conversation with Nathan Hare and his critique of the Black middle class. Cannon's late 1970s writings reveal that his efforts around normalizing and naturalizing work and family as normal and natural aspects of Blackness were not just intended to unlock individual health, but to help Black Americans cultivate a deep enough shared race feeling amongst other African Americans and African diasporic people in a process he referred to as re-Africanization, To him, re-Africanization reignited Black people's cultural connection with Africa in order to create an economics based on, quote, a supportive spiritual cultural matrix of Blackness, whereby Black Americans marshaled the fruits of their work and family life away from white society and towards Black America, Africa, and the African diaspora. Cannon believed that the more deeply and widely felt that African descended people felt connected to each other, the more effective the therapeutic effect of his approach would be. Such an approach effectively asked Black working class people to overlook tensions within the Black community along class lines in a similar manner to how white elites encourage white workers to overlook their, quote, practically identical interests with Black workers after Reconstruction. According to W.E.B. Du Bois, it was precisely the cultivation of a white racial feeling amongst the, quote, poor white and planter that helped produce, quote, such astonishing economic results for white Americans by the 1960s. However, whereas Du Bois lamented a missed opportunity for workers across racial lines to overthrow capitalist elites in the aftermath of the emancipation, Cannon saw the 1960s as an opportunity for Black Americans to unite across class lines against white supremacy by marshaling their resources to build an economy he believed contributed that could counterbalance the economics and supportive spiritual cultural matrix he perceived to have been built between white elites and white workers since the 1880s. To show proof it was possible for non-Anglo descended people to be successful as a racial class in mainstream America, Cannon pointed to Jewish and Japanese Americans, quote, two formerly abused ethnic groups who by the 1960s he perceived were, quote, not only surviving, but were prospering because of their comprehension and recognition of the essentiality of core identity enhancement programs. Just like the cultural and economic connection of many white Americans to European nations, Cannon attributed Jewish and Japanese American success to their, quote, constant contact, acceptance, and involvement with, quote unquote, ancestral lands, particularly after the establishment of the State of Israel in the 1940s and the rebirth of Japan's economy after World War II. He argued the psychic connection each group maintained to their, quote, home of homes through language courses, cultural schools, and community celebrations allowed each to safely navigate white spaces because it, quote, nurtured and replenished their sense of self, no matter their class or social location in society. This is like multiculturalism. This connection helped American Jews, for instance, avoid the psychic tension of double consciousness by allowing them to, quote, safely identify with both Israel and America while recognizing the, quote, dangers of over assimilation and consequent loss of identity in adopted homelands. Rather than limit the work of, quote, identity enhancement or African core clarification and construction efforts to mental health professionals, Cannon demanded his re-Africanization efforts be joined by historians, archaeologists, economists, artists, architects, business experts, spiritualists, educators, behavioralists, and health workers. This is his list. His work to manifest a psychologically therapeutic landscape produced a slew of anti-poverty community projects outside of the formal boundaries of mental health, with Ron Karenga, the founder of Kwanzaa, and the US organization. So he really, like his community partner is really Ron Karenga. These projects included the Mafundi Arts Institute, a Black Arts Center, the Inner City Cultural Center, a multicultural theater, and Ujima Village, a low to moderate income master planned community built with the participation of over 50 community organizations and leaders. That Central City's activities might have appeared to be unremarkable, unscientific, and everyday to the untrained eye is exactly what made Cannon's mental health clinic so successful. Cannon offered Black residents a vision of normality and health based on ideas of economic participation, gender and sexuality in health, based on that were already familiar and widely regarded in shared cultural discourse as common sense. It was also a vision of health and normality not unlike the one offered by USC's Watts Clinic. What made the directives different, however, was the continuing and haunting suspicion that white-led anti-poverty programs hid an ulterior motive of sustaining racism in new guises, and a new growing belief that Black-led anti-poverty programs centered on Black nationalism and capitalism had the capacity to finally authenticate Black communities as modern and developed. Whereas USC's clinic struggled at the end of 1968 to meet its anti-poverty programming agenda, Central City's patient caseload boasted a yearly count of more than 5,000 patients a year. So popular and widely successful were Central City's programs in carrying out anti-poverty objectives that Cannon and other Black mental health professionals broke ground in late 1968 to erect a new $3.7 million mental health center with funding from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare and from private donations. That's $33.4 million today. That Central City programs appeared to be more successful in engaging Black residents in anti-poverty efforts than USC's clinics, despite sharing essentially the same programmatic objectives, helps account for Georgie's and Truncata's decision to depart leadership by appointing Dr. Rodney Powell, a Black pediatrician, to serve as the face of the clinic and stabilize its day-to-day operations in 1969. Powell's leadership then helped USC's leaders engineer steps for another Black physician, Dr. Clifton Cole, to take the reins in 1970, and it becomes an independent neighborhood health center at that point. As he exited, Truncata indicated his strong belief that USC's leadership did not adequately anticipate the Black Power movement's ability to capture the imagination of Black residents. Rather than fight the obstacles presented to white leaders by Black Power, Truncata argued it was important for anti-poverty administrators to get behind Black people's, quote, call for freedom from white colonial policies, because its narratives appeared to be more successful in getting citizens to participate in anti-poverty programming as designed than traditional civil rights narratives of integration. Truncata, however, was careful to educate funders against supporting certain visions of Black Power, like the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam, that he believed promoted violence and generated further racial hatred. White liberal progressives like Truncata were not alone in educating others about the differences between Black cultural nationalists like Cannon and Karenga and Black radicals like the Black Panther Party's Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. Unlike Black cultural nationalists focused on forging racial cohesiveness around heterosexuality and Black capitalism, the Panthers argued for a complete overthrow of capitalism by working in coalition with oppressed and working class people, regardless of their racial, gender, and sexual identities. They were more willing, for instance, to work with welfare rights organizers in the NWRO and with gay and lesbian activists organized in the Gay Liberation Front, because they shared an analysis that saw capitalism as a process that depended on race, gender, and sexuality to create class inequality. As Huey Newton explained, quote, as far as returning per se to the ancient African customs, we don't see any necessity in this. We say the only culture worthwhile holding on to is a revolutionary culture. The only way we're going to be free is by seizing political power, which comes through the barrel of a gun. In this regard, Cannon saw the Panthers' plans in 1968 to open a clinic of their own in Los Angeles as alarming, because it threatened the imagined cohesiveness of his therapeutic model by mobilizing the Black working class towards futures that eroded the relatedness of normative descriptions of gender and race underpinning his re-Africanization theory. In fact, most Panthers scholars attribute the diminished power of the Panthers Southern California chapter not only to the repressive surveillance and violent hostility of the Panthers chapter's experience at the hands of the FBI, CIA, and LAPD, but also to the Panthers' famous shootout with Ron Karenga's Symbol Force at UCLA that resulted in the death of John Huggins and Bunchy Carter, who were two Black Panthers, right? Cannon is involved in this because they're fighting for the future of the Black Student Union. And Carter and Huggins were about to become the leaders of the Black Student Union, right? And so Cannon is alarmed. He's like, we can't have this. Fewer scholars, however, have attributed the outsized imbalance of influence that Black cultural nationalists held in Los Angeles due to the deep pockets and political power of the Black and white politicians who supported them through anti-poverty funding. My research shows that key rising Black political figures traditionally aligned with the civil rights movement, such as Councilman turned Mayor Tom Bradley and Congressman Augustus Hawkins, spent a lot of political and financial capital in supporting Cannon's anti-poverty mental health projects because they gave them, as Daniel Widener argues, an ability to, quote, demonstrate affinity with and support for Black residents of South Los Angeles because it celebrated Black culture without necessarily supporting an insurgent form of urban politics. By tipping the scales in favor of Black cultural nationalists, Black political leaders in Los Angeles effectively helped short-circuit other visions of Black freedom, not pinned to the gender distinctiveness and sexual patterns of breadwinning manhood, by presenting Black nationalism as sort of a false choice alternative to integration. I would love to talk more about these alternatives in the question and answer period. So what I'd like to do by way of a conclusion is discuss what leaders in the city did based on their observation of the two clinics. Health system planners in charge of designing the rest of the Watts health system took heed from the lessons furnished by USC's clinic and Central City by making sure that King Drew's public hospital, Black-led medical school, and public clinics network's identity conformed to the racial demographics of the communities surrounding it. Particularly if shifts in global capital required cheaper labor closer to downtown. My research shows that this formula presenting work and normative family life as uniquely anti-colonial helped usher a range of anti-poverty and municipal funding to not just Black communities, but also to gay, Asian, and Chicano neighborhoods whose leaders adapted Black nationalism in the form of Black capitalism to remake Los Angeles into a global city. There are also important takeaways that are beyond the immediate local politics of Los Angeles. If, as I have suggested here, that the Jim Crow New Deal of the 1930s and 1940s made by the end of World War II access to healthcare contingent on the presence of a male breadwinner and on the obedience of women and children to that breadwinner to distribute healthcare to the rest of society, then the anti-poverty clinics and community mental health clinics of the 60s and 70s point to an understudied history of experimentation on poor people of color and their communities. So this is like a different way of experimentation, right? Not the kind of like Tuskegee syphilis experimentation. This is like how to bureaucratically distribute healthcare to get a kind of outcome. Rather than use bodies of color for human experimentation, the seemingly benign objectives of anti-poverty clinics and community mental health clinics point to a new techno-scientific, a bunch of new techno-scientific experiments centered on the distribution of health services that prioritize employment and sexual reform of poor citizens as more urgent and pressing objectives than getting individuals to a state absent of the presence of disease or illness, or to a state of lasting health and wellness. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nick. All of your archival resources are so rich, and I'm so looking forward to seeing.
Yes.
I mean, there's so much there. I'm so looking forward to seeing the book when it's out.
You and me both.
We have time for questions, but perhaps while folks are thinking about questions for you, I would like to abuse my powers of the microphone and ask one first. I was really interested in that use in your book title, Global Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Right, thinking about Los Angeles very intentionally in that way. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit upon that that term and how it relates to healthcare in that city at that time, how it relates to this work and the book as a whole.
Yes, so the term really, this is now the urban historian. Urban historian is now in the room. I'm interested in this move from the manufacturing economy to a kind of new global financial economy, right? So like by the 1960s and 70s, the United States no longer, well, American corporations are like, we need to move our operations closer to competing markets in Europe and Asia, right? And in order to do that, the actual layout of cities have to change. The cities that become important are the cities that lay home to those financial firms that can help transact the capital, resources, and people needed to make that transition happen, okay? I actually see that the Los Angeles leaders, when they elect Bradley, they're very concerned about whether or not LA will become what people call a global city like New York and London, right? And Tokyo. And because they, believe it or not, feel like there's competition from like Denver, San Francisco, all of these places. And the winch to make LA into a global city is that it has a downtown that is vacated and there are limitless amounts of cheap labor. Okay? But at the same time, Bradley is really concerned. Mayor Bradley is really concerned because he realizes that if people don't find work, what do? They leave. Okay? So he's like, I don't want to become St. Louis and I don't want to become Detroit. So what he does is he basically subsidizes the relocation of financial firms to downtown Los Angeles through public health services, public housing, right? Because they take the edge off. These employers don't have to pay for healthcare. They don't have to worry about housing, right? And they get cheap labor. And you can see what I'm interested in the way in which Bradley takes everything that Cannon is doing because Bradley is funding everything that Cannon is doing. Everything that, right? Augustus Hawkins, Cannon. And when he ascends as mayor, he goes to the Asian community, he goes to the gay community. He says, this is the way that we keep poor people in LA and they get to, I'm going to use this, it might be a controversial term, but he says, I'm making an opportunity economy for Los Angeles. And what he means by that is we are coming out of an economy where everyone abandoned Black workers and they abandoned Black neighborhoods. And I may not like these cheap jobs that are coming into LA that are being offered to Black workers, but it's a job, right? He says, he basically has a policy that a job is better than no job. And he is more willing to work with, and so this is actually like how he wins, is that downtown money realize that Bradley has the fix. And so what you see after this chapter is what the city does to re-engineer all of that, right? Because they realize without the new Bunker Hills financial district, which is the new financial district in LA, that the global capital doesn't flow to LA, it's not going to flow to Hollywood, it's not going to flow to Orange County, it's not, right? He says that is the linchpin. But I'm saying the true linchpins are all the neighborhoods of color. And what makes that possible is what they do with these health services, right? Like one of the chapters, if you read one of the articles, is LA engineers a homeless ordinance enforced district called Skid Row. It modernizes Skid Row. I know that sounds weird. By saying, how do we help? He's like, how do I help gay leaders in West LA, Black leaders in South LA, Chicano leaders in East LA to get rid of the undesirable mentally ill people they don't like in their neighborhoods. I'm going to locate the only homeless services in LA in this place called Skid Row. So people, this is about landscapes of desire. You understand what I'm saying? All social workers, they say to all of these patients, the only place you can get these services is Skid Row. And how do you keep them there? Bradley uses the one thing that he knows taxpayers will sink money into. He builds out a much larger police station. So it's an asylum without walls because it uses the police as the walls. And if you've ever been to Little Tokyo and had delicious food there, you feel it when you cross the street into Skid Row because there's a formal designation. Nowadays, well, we can talk about that. There's now a new iteration because the most expensive land in LA now is Skid Row. And so the city is like, well, we want that to be developed. So now there's like now a huge homeless issue. Yeah. Sorry. Yes. Oh, sorry.
There's an online audit. Thank you, Nick. This is a very, very rich archive, as you know. But, you know, I'm interested in, from the vantage point of Black studies, right? Thinking about that most of the players that you're talking about are Black folks who have relations to an institution.
Yep.
And so what I see this chapter at is a real study of institutions.
Yes,
Because I could see you mapping this analysis or this historization or historiography, if you will, onto even the police,
Yeah.
right?
mhm,
And thinking about the many Black police chiefs, right? Who engage in this kind of idea of cleaning up the community, and the
Yep.
way to do that is by instituting a set of standards that European Americans have created as the kind of creme de la creme of institutionality. And so part of what I'm interested in hearing you talk about for this audience particularly is thinking about, can you talk more about how it is that Black people's relationship to institutions in some ways contaminate or even confound them, right?
yes,
And so I think about Bradley being mayor of a city.
yes,
Right?
a majority
having-
white city, yeah,
And Cannon having to be a part of a psychiatric tradition.
correct,
Having to kind of fit within to the tradition, which is the institutionalization, right? Like it's process of institutionalization. So I'm really interested in how we can not necessarily make, clean the hands of Black folks, but at the same time, give reason to their participation in certain types of practices that we might consider anti-Black.
correct, yes. Thank you for this, because you have identified what I have been, why it's taken me so long to write this book. Because some people look at my critique of racial liberalism and they're like, oh my goodness, Black people are just as anti-Black as white people, right? That is not what I'm saying, right? What I'm actually working in is the argument is that I'm working within, to account for Bradley and Cannon, I'm thinking through Derek Bell's interest convergence, which is this idea that Black politicians, this is like, Derek Bell is writing about interest conversion because he's realizing like there's only so much we can do at a certain point in time around school desegregation. And he realizes that white voters are only going to be interested in hoarding Black interests so long as their interests advance with Black interests. And that's a problem. And part of what I'm showing you here is the problem with health dispersion in Black communities is that health itself is a property of whiteness. And if that is true, okay, the only way that Black people in this system, right, in this society is they have to either figure out Black capitalism or they have to figure out the white vote, right? Throughout this whole time, Bradley, Cannon, all the Black physicians that I'm looking at have to hedge their own bet. They're like, we can only do what we think voters will tolerate or outright support, okay? So what am I interested in? I'm interested in all the people that are like, you know what, like we're Black freedom dreaming. They're not necessarily interested in like, mainstream politics. They may or may not be. Actually, like Johnny Tillman, very much, right? What people don't know about Johnny Tillman and the NWRO is by the late 1960s, she's done with George Wiley and the coalition that is like in bed with like literally white labor leaders. And so for the early part of the NWRO, you see like it's women on welfare who say, we are women in the home as well. And Johnny Tillman's like, I'm a Black woman and I want to work. Like, I don't want to be, you know what I mean? Like, I want a choice. So actually, what changes all of this is actually Johnny Tillman's health leadership and activism in King Drew Medical Center, okay? So there's a little bit there. I will say that it gets co-opted because it's still in the system of like, you know what I mean? Where, the property of health has to be meted out either by capitalism or by the vote, right? The other more interesting thing, so this is like Nixon. I could talk more about this and more. I'm really interested, my book ends with Octavia Butler. And Wild Seed and Mind of My Mind. This is not only her critique of white supremacy, this is a critique of multiculturalism. Because she sees it unfolding around her. And she says, so I'll I don't want to give away the whole book. But basically, she's interested in Wild Seed. She's criticizing Black nationalism through the character of Doro, who literally is trying to engineer a race, right? Through traditional kinship patterns. He does not deviate from breadwinning manhood and stay-at-home motherhood in his vision. When we get to Mind of My Mind, Mary's like her way of reproducing society. You don't need traditional kinship patterns, right? But it's still a kinship pattern that depends on exclusion. So when she makes Foresight into the site of where all these mind readers, and it's like now getting crazy. She's saying, I refuse the wages. I refuse these two ways of thinking, this like liberal multiculturalism way and this white supremacy way. I want a different way. And I think she's trying to actually work through that by actually, now you can see where I think my second book project is going, right? Because I only had time in the epilogue to do this because I'm trying to get tenure. And I think that she's really working as a fugitive science to speak back to like, and she's not like making up stuff. She's like really serious about the science. I think there's something, and she's also really interesting because she actually believes in biological determinism. So I'm like, what about that, Octavia? But there's a way that she's marshalling it in a way where it's not tied to conceptions of race, gender, and sexuality. That's what I think is really interesting. She's pointing to a new world, and I actually think in Parable of the Sower, she's showing that, like, if you really want to know how to survive the apocalypse that is coming, you got to look at queer folk. You better look at people of color, because they have been surviving in an economy with nothing since the 1980s, since the 1970s. So she's not writing about the future, y'all. She is talking about the present. But that's why I'm looking to, like, what are the other ways of freedom dreaming about how to be in the world? She doesn't think it has to do anything with like race, gender, and sexuality. It's everything to do with responding to what's happening now. Sorry.
Thank you so much. We are over time.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. So I am going to suggest that we move into the reception, and that if you have other questions for Dr. Ellis, I'm sure a ton of people do, we can harass you over a glass of wine.
Please harass me.
Great, excellent. Well, let's retire to that room and another round of applause for Dr. Ellis.
Ooh. Thank you so much.